The long-awaited Wicked movie adaptation of the fan-favorite musical is finally being released this November, so I thought it'd be a fun time to do a deep dive into the history of Wicked and the Wizard of Oz. Because the lore goes all the way back to 1900 when The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was first published, which has continued to be a mainstay in popular culture for over 100 years, with movies, TV shows, video games, books, and musicals with different interpretations of the plot, characters, and universe of Oz. One of the most famous being Wicked, the prequel about the life and times of the Wicked Witch of the West. So let's go on a journey through the history, production, and behind the scenes of making The Wizard of Oz. Hello, I went on a bit of a rabbit hole deep dive while researching for this video because I got so fascinated by old Hollywood and how corrupt it is. You may think that The Wizard of Oz is just a cute children's movie, but unfortunately this video will crack that veneer because the production of The Wizard of Oz was atrocious and terrifying. And I think it's an important enough story to be its own video, so rather than covering The Wizard of Oz to Wicked, I'm going to focus this video on the history of The Wizard of Oz 1939 film, and I would love to make future videos about the Wicked book/musical, and then maybe another one about the 2024 Wicked movie. So please like, comment, subscribe, and let me know if you'd want to see those videos. So last month, I saw the touring production of Wicked, and to prepare for it, I watched The Wizard of Oz for the first time since I was a child, and I went on such a rabbit hole learning everything about Oz and reading the original story. Right now I'm listening to the Wicked audiobook, so I'm very immersed in the Oz Wicked culture right now, and I'm going to give a brief overview of the history, important events, and controversies of the Wizard of Oz film, but there's just so much to include. In 1900, the American author L. Frank Baum would publish the children's fantasy book The Wonderful Wizard of Oz with illustrations from W. W. Denslow. L. Frank Baum would start writing children's books in the 1890s and would already be a successful children's author. So when The Wizard of Oz came out, it was an instant success, becoming the best-selling children's book for the 2 years after its publication. And The Wizard of Oz would actually become a franchise for him, and he would release 13 more novels about the people of Oz. Although the most well-known adaptation of The Wizard of Oz is the MGM 1939 movie, The Wizard of Oz was actually adapted many times prior to that. Shortly after the first book was published, Baum and Denslow worked to create a musical of The Wizard of Oz that debuted on Broadway in 1903 and 1904. And in 1910, they would make a series of silent films based on the 1902 stage musical. L. Frank Baum would make his own production company, the Oz Film Manufacturing Company, that would release silent films and silent shorts in 1914 and 15, with Baum writing the scripts of these films. And following L. Frank Baum's death in 1919, it would continue to have adaptations like the 1935 silent film and the 1993 animated short. So first, let's talk a bit about the plot of The Wizard of Oz. Despite the numerous interpretations of The Wizard of Oz, the story mainly follows the same couple beats. A young farm girl, Dorothy Gale, and her beloved dog Toto get transported in a twister to the colorful, whimsical world of Oz. Her house is lifted and then lands on the Wicked Witch of the East, killing her and setting the Munchkins free from her slavery. The Good Witch of the North and the Munchkins celebrate Dorothy's accidental manslaughter, and the Good Witch suggests that Dorothy take the Wicked Witch of the East's jeweled shoes. But Dorothy is focused on wanting to find a way back home. She learns that she needs to journey to the Emerald City and meet the wizard who may be able to help her. Along the way, she meets a scarecrow who wishes he had a brain, a tin man who wishes he had a heart, and a lion who wishes he has courage. They journey to the Wizard of Oz, but when they get there, the wizard won't grant them their wishes unless they kill the Wicked Witch of the West. And Dorothy and her crew confront the Wicked Witch of the West. In anger, Dorothy throws a pail of water over the witch, not realizing that water will cause her to melt and die. Dorothy and the crew return to the Wizard of Oz to claim their prize for killing the Wicked Witch of the West, but the wizard denies rewarding them. They uncover that the great and terrible Oz is really just an old man from the Midwest who came to Oz by a balloon. Although the wizard is a fraud, he's able to sweet talk his way out of them being mad at him, telling the Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Lion that they gained heart and brains and courage through their journey, and they're all satisfied with this, but Dorothy still wishes to return home. The wizard decides to set up a balloon to help her journey back, but the balloon departs without her, leaving her all alone with no way to get back to Kansas. But when Dorothy thinks all hope is lost, the Good Witch of the North returns and reveals to Dorothy that she's always had the power to return home. All she had to do was click her heels together 3 times from the shoes she got from the Wicked Witch of the East. And Dorothy says her goodbyes and returns home. In the 1920s and 30s, everything was changing in the movie industry. They were able to make talking pictures for the first time that was able to synchronize dialogue and sound rather than just the silent film, and the introduction of Technicolor, where films could be filmed in color for the first time, and the progression of animation, like Walt Disney. Walt Disney and his production company, they would make many successful animated shorts, probably one of the most well-known being Steamboat Willie, that was released in 1928 and was Disney's first short to have synchronized sound with it. Welcome to the public domain. And soon after, in the 1930s, Disney would start releasing animations in color, like the Silly Symphony series. You can actually find a lot of these on Disney+. They're very interesting and pretty cute. But in 1934, Disney got the idea to make the first English full-length feature animated film in color, which would end up being Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And this was an extremely ambitious and expensive project, but it was a complete success, becoming the highest grossing film of all time at that point, and it would be very inspirational seeing Walt Disney adapt a classic fairy tale into this full-length colored talking movie at this point, which would be a big inspiration for MGM to make their own story based on a children's fairy tale, The Wizard of Oz.
We're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz.
So let's go back a bit and talk about what's happening in the early 1900s around the film industry and how MGM was created and the culture around it. I think this is going to be pretty important going through the production of The Wizard of Oz, because you need to understand how insane the movie industry was in the early 1900s. It all starts when, in the 1920s, business tycoon Marcus Loew, who ran a successful chain of vaudeville and movie theaters across America, would create MGM by first acquiring the silent film production company Metro Pictures Corporation, and soon he would be in talks to merge Metro Pictures with another film studio, Goldwyn Pictures, in 1924. And Louis B. Mayer, who ran a smaller production studio, contacted Marcus Loew about acquiring his production studio as well, creating what we now know as Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. I've always wondered who Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer are. So Metro is just the name of the production company ran by multiple people. But funnily enough, Samuel Goldwyn actually left Goldwyn Pictures by the time it was acquired by MGM. He is another film producer, but he was never involved in MGM despite his name being on one of the biggest production companies in the world. Except they would take the mascot Leo the Lion from Goldwyn Pictures and use it for MGM. They even use it today. So the only name that's actually a person associated with MGM is Louis B. Mayer, who is the, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in that. And Mayer is an important part of the MGM history, and he's important in relation to the production of The Wizard of Oz. I do want to give props to all these men for pioneering the film industry, but I also want to say that they're all gross creeps, particularly Louis B. Mayer. Every quote from him is like a try not to vomit challenge, I swear. But we're going to talk about this more when we talk about how the studios would treat their employees and actors. Throughout the 1920s, MGM was focusing on silent films, but in the late 1920s, they would start experimenting with Technicolor. The studio was actually pretty reluctant to get on the new craze of talking movies rather than silent films. So this time in Hollywood, the 1920s to around the end of the 1940s, is considered the golden age of Hollywood, and it was ruled by these big production companies like Paramount, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, and they had this studio system in which all of the filmmaking, production to distribution was all done by these production companies, and the studios would also use a star system where they would have actors like on retainer, and those actors, they would sell to the public and change their names, lives, background to make them more profitable and continue putting them in movie after movie while they were on contract. In the 1930s, MGM produced about 50 films a year, which is insane to think about if you think about movie production today. So if you were a star signed to their studio, you'd be making 2 to 3 movies a year. So the star that we're going to be focusing on when talking about The Wizard of Oz is Judy Garland, who was born as Frances Ethel Gumm, who would go on to star in the leading role in The Wizard of Oz. So Frances has basically been working her entire life. She began performing at 2.5 with her family's vaudeville act along with her older sisters. Her parents were vaudeville performers, and in case you didn't know what vaudeville is, because I didn't, it's a singing, dancing, and comedy act. The family would continue to perform, and when moving to Lancaster, California, they would have even more opportunities to perform. The 3 sisters would make their own group as the Gumm sisters, and they would even be featured in some movies. Frances began to impress the audiences with her voice at an early age. In this newspaper review, they would say about 13-year-old Frances, "She handles ballads like a veteran and gets every note and rod over with her personality that hits audiences. For comedy, she affects a pan like night and delivers her stuff in a manner as the comic. Nothing slow about her on hot stuff. And to top it off, she hoofs." So basically they're saying she's a triple threat even at 13. The Gumm sisters would soon be renamed the Garland sisters when looking for a more marketable name. While they continued to rise to popularity, Frances would change her name to Judy in 1935. And shortly after this, she would audition for MGM. Judy would get signed to MGM, and everyone would be very impressed with her talents, but she wouldn't immediately go into filming a picture. She was actually loaned out to 20th Century Fox for the film Pigskin Parade for her first feature role. Here's a crazy newspaper clipping about the aftermath of Judy starring in this film. It would say, Hollywood, November 6th. Oh, that just happened. It's like November 9th right now. So it says, girl, 14, made up to look 18. Bright-eyed songstress of Pigskin Parade on stage 8 years. Hollywood, November 6th. Judy Garland, the bright-eyed songstress of Pigskin Parade, was made up and dressed up to look 18. Judy didn't like that. No woman wants to be older than she is. Judy is 14, or rather she will be next January 10. Oh wait, she's 13 in this then. I don't know why they're saying she's 14 even in the headline. It's kind of misleading. MGM loaned her to 20th Century Fox without specifying how she could be dressed. In fact, MGM didn't have a great deal of interest in Judy until reports came back from 20th Century about her. Judy's studio wants to keep her as young as it can. The studio biography says she's 12. And then there's a headline, been in vaudeville. Judy says she's had 8 years of stage experience, and that's correct. Her folks have been in vaudeville, and Judy and her older 2 sisters sang in vaudeville until one of them got married and broke up the act. Judy's folks were living there, running a little theater. So Judy asked her manager if he thought she could take a chance in the movies. Let Judy tell it. My manager took me to MGM, and I sang for Mr. Robbins. Then I sang for Miss Coverman. Then I sang for Mr. Mayer. He had me sing for Mr. Katz. Then I got a contract. I didn't do anything for months until I was put in a 2-reeler that isn't finished yet. I guess I was lucky to be borrowed even if I didn't like myself. That's just like Judy, interrupted her mother. She's never satisfied with anything. I thought she was awfully good, but she doesn't agree. Anyway, as a result of the picture, Judy has been cast in the Broadway Melody of 1937 in a very important role. She'll sing, and she'll get the chance to act. Judy went to MGM school for several months, but lately she's transferred to a public school, the first she's ever attended, because they teach so many more things, like cooking and sewing. In MGM school, she met Jackie Cooper, who claims her as his girlfriend. She likes the public school because of the seniors. She's a freshman, or a 9-A, are permitted to wear red sweaters. Judy is fully grown up, yet she isn't. For a 14-year-old, she's well developed, mentally and physically, and already is beginning to worry about her weight. She's 5 feet 1.5 inches and weighs 106 pounds, but she's going to take off 10 of those pounds. Her hair is brown, so are her eyes, which are small but sparkling. She'd like to be a movie star. Many enthusiasts say Judy will be, even before she's graduated from high school. So in this article, you can already see that they're trying to first craft Judy this image of being like a sweet all-American girl, but also she's mentally and physically well developed, and she's going to be the next big star. To me, it's crazy how invasive it is to put her height and weight in the article, but I guess that's just how things were back then. But Judy's weight would actually be a big concern for the studio. They would constantly be telling her she needs to lose weight and give her methods of doing that, which we'll talk about later. On February 24th, 1938, Variety would first publish a trade paper saying that Leroy will produce The Wizard of Oz. The newspapers would publish stories about every single update of The Wizard of Oz. Almost the entire production timeline is pretty clear from all of these newspaper publications. So MGM first announced that they're making The Wizard of Oz in February, and of course they would need a cast for the production. And Judy Garland to star as Dorothy was one of the first roles cast. Here's a newspaper clipping from that time where they say, "Remember Dorothy, the Wizard, the Gnome King, and Belinda, the Amazing Hen? From Frank Baum's childhood classics, the Oz books? Well, these beloved characters are coming to screen on Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's production of The Wizard of Oz, with Judy Garland already set for the role of Dorothy. Probably it's Snow White's influence that is responsible for MGM's plan to bring another childhood story to the screen, and they are lucky to have prevailed upon Sam Goldwyn to part with the screen rights. Sam has had many offers for the Baum stories, which he had held for years, but since he has no juvenile stars on his roster, he consented to part with them. Mervyn Leroy will produce The Wizard of Oz after The Unvanquished." I found this spicy take in one of the newspapers that says, "Pet peeve of the week. The news that Metro will film The Wizard of Oz with real people, and with Judy Garland in the role of Dorothy. Miss Garland is a hotshot Hollywood debutante, and a precociously developed one at that. So they'll probably have her introducing swing music to the Emerald City and teaching the Tin Woodman to dance the Big Apple. I hope the ghost of L. Frank Baum gives Samuel Goldwyn a good haunting for not selling the rights to the Oz books to Walt Disney." I can't help but say I agree. I'm actually going to talk a little bit later when I talk about Wicked as how I've always envisioned Wicked to be a 2D animated film and how I think it's the perfect medium for it. What if The Wizard of Oz was sold to Walt Disney? I want to live in that timeline. I want to live in the timeline where everyone loves animation and we make more of it. And many publications are talking about the impact on Snow White in the movie industry. This one says, "Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs started its record-breaking run. Motion picture producers have been wondering if fairy tales with human actors wouldn't be a good bet. All of the companies are looking for fairy tales, and as fast as they can find them. All the younger stars from Shirley Temple to Deanna Durbin will be put to work in them." And on the script side of the production of The Wizard of Oz, the film would actually go through 10 different screenwriters, although only 3 of them would have credit in the final project. They would actually have trouble deciding how closely they want to follow the source material of The Wizard of Oz. Noel Langley would make a major contribution to the script by fleshing out more of Dorothy's story in Kansas before she's transported to Oz, like including counterparts of farmhands for the Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Lion, and Dorothy's mean neighbor, who would be the same actress to portray the Wicked Witch of the West. And before production would start on The Wizard of Oz, they would begin publishing articles about Judy Garland like this one that says, "Judy Garland is 14 and definitely precocious, but good fun. Her wisecracking is garnished with modesty, and her trim little figure is obscured by unflattering juvenile frocks. Judy is trying her very best to remain a child until Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer decides that she can be an ingenue. That will be a little more than a year. Her 16th birthday will be June 10th, 1939. No can eat. The studio decided she didn't look childish enough for her role in Everybody Sings. So they put her on a routine of diet, exercise, and massage, which reduced her hips 3 inches. She's still on a diet. I had lunch with her and her mother the other day, and she was grumbling about it, also saying she was recently announced for the role of Dorothy in MGM's version of The Wizard of Oz. The selection drew a great deal of adverse comment, as much from Judy Garland fans as anyone else. She herself is a little uneasy about it." And soon they would start announcing the cast members for the other roles in The Wizard of Oz. And The Wizard of Oz being a very troubled production, they would have problems throughout the whole production, but starting with the cast. They would cast Ray Bolger as the Tin Woodman. They would cast Buddy Ebsen as the Scarecrow, and initially they would have trouble casting the Cowardly Lion, and they would announce that the witch would be cast as Gail Sondergaard. When they began doing makeup and costume testing with the witch, they initially wanted her to look very much like the evil queen in Snow White, down to even how her head covering was. In this article, the producer Mervyn Leroy even says, "Witches, with their crooked noses and long fingers and tall peaked hats, always are the same. I thought we should have a different kind of witch, one with class, and maybe sex appeal. Gail Sondergaard will be our witch," a 1938 version. This version of the witch would never come to fruition because when they were doing makeup tests with her, they felt like she looked too beautiful and they wanted the witch to look ugly. And eventually when they were doing makeup tests, Gail would decide to leave the part of the Wicked Witch, not wanting to present herself as ugly on screen. and she says she has no regrets turning down this part. So they would go in a new direction for the Wicked Witch and, funnily enough, do what Leroy was saying they weren't going to do. They would make a crooked nose, long finger, tall peaked hat type of witch, played by Margaret Hamilton.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog, too.
And cast Billy Burke as Glinda the Good Witch of the North.
Only bad witches are ugly.
And as I was talking before about Ray Bolger and Buddy Ebsen cast as the Tin Woodman and the Scarecrow, Ray would actually want to switch roles because he wanted to play the Scarecrow rather than the Tin Man, feeling like it was a better part for him as a dancer, and he was a big fan of the Scarecrow on Broadway. And this simple change that Buddy Ebsen was unbothered by would end up almost costing him his life. And The Wizard of Oz would begin filming October 13th, 1938. They really rushed through pre-production, and I think it shows, but that was just the way movies were done back then. But I feel like this is a really good lesson to people nowadays when making movies to really think about all aspects of character design, set design, costuming before you just rush into filming, because all of these problems could have been avoided if they were prepared. After 12 days of filming, the director would be fired and the first 12 days of footage would be scrapped. So let's talk about what happened in those 12 days. Most of the characters would have somewhat different designs. Judy Garland would be wearing a blonde wig and have heavier makeup compared to what we see in the final movie. And the costuming for all of the characters, like the Witch and the Tin Man and the Scarecrow, would end up changing. The Witch had her hair down in some of the early scenes. But one of the worst tragedies that happened was Buddy Ebsen, who was playing the Tin Man, would have a severe allergic reaction to his costume. They were using aluminum powder on the costume to make it look more silver. It's made out of leather and would have to be hospitalized. MGM scrambled to recast his role, borrowing an actor from 20th Century Fox, Jack Haley, to be the Tin Man. They changed the Tin Man's costume to no longer having aluminum powder, but having an aluminum paste instead. The studio was very vague about what happened to Buddy, just saying that he was ill. The Tin Man, Jack Haley, thought that he quit the film. And the studio would fire the director, Richard Thorpe, not liking his interpretation of Oz. And they would start filming again with the interim director, George Cukor, who actually wasn't interested in The Wizard of Oz. He wanted to be working on Gone with the Wind. But he has been credited for making a lot of the changes to the characters' designs, like removing Dorothy's blonde wig and her heavier makeup. Also, apparently, Dorothy was acting more proper, and he gave her the advice to be more like a girl from Kansas, which people think influenced the final product and her acting in the film. This Richard Thorpe version of The Wizard of Oz has become a great interest to film historians. There's actually a lot of detail on everything that happened in that production, which scenes they filmed. It was primarily the scenes with Dorothy and the Scarecrow, and how the different actors looked, how different the film could have been. All of the footage from this era of The Wizard of Oz has been lost. There's only small clips of footage from behind the scenes while they were filming. But they did take a lot of promotional photos of the cast during this time, so we can get a pretty clear picture of the character designs that they were going for. So the film would resume filming with George Cukor as the interim director before Victor Fleming would take over, who is considered to be like the real director and the only credited one in the production, even though they would go through 4 directors. So Victor Fleming would take over production November 1983, but Victor's 4 months as director wouldn't be without problems. In 1939, Photoplay Studies released a companion magazine about the production of Wizard of Oz, but most of the behind-the-scenes accidents weren't known at this point. So in this magazine, they mainly discuss casting for the actors and the costumes and sets and the special effects. Assembling 120 little people to play the Munchkins in the musical also drew a big amount of fanfare from the press because it's such an interesting story. But there was a lot of ableist language around the people who were cast as the Munchkins, and it's probably one of the more controversial elements of the film. In the Photoplay Studies magazine, they write, I'm sorry for reading this quote because it's kind of gross, but this is what they said about it. Baum said the creatures were tiny people, but find them. Dwarves or deformed persons were not wanted. Midgets, being perfect humans, excepting for size, were wanted. The whole nation was scoured, and 120 brought to Hollywood to play the Munchkins. It took 4 months, meaning, again, headaches, but it was accomplished. And they also talk about how the designer made 120 individual costumes for all of the Munchkin actors. So this is a controversial and like often talked about part of the production of Wizard of Oz is the Munchkins were disruptive and misogynistic on set and harassed Judy Garland. In 1967, Judy Garland gave an interview where she would joke about the Munchkins being little drunks and saying one of them asked her out, which would lead the Munchkin actors to defend themselves, saying that they like to drink but only outside of work hours, and even Judy Garland's children say that she liked to over-exaggerate in her stories, so they don't really believe her. Judy's ex-husband, when he would release his own biography, would claim that Judy was groped by some of the Munchkins on set, and this story would come up every couple of years, and the surviving Munchkins would have to try to debunk it.
90% fabrication. It makes for good copy, I guess.
But at this point, they've all passed on, so I guess we'll never know the truth. The Munchkin actors weren't properly credited in the film. There's actually no definitive numbers, they're not sure if there was 122 or 124 in total, but about a dozen of them were played by child actors as background filler. But outside of this, there was more abuse that Judy faced while on the set of Wizard of Oz. There was a scene where Judy was filming with the Cowardly Lion, and she was reprimanded for not being able to stay in character and laughing during takes. So the director, Victor Fleming, pulled her aside and allegedly said, "Now, darling, this is serious," before slapping her across the face and then saying, "Go in there and work." And then she apparently, according to legend, finished the scenes, no problem. This is one of those stories that's in every biography, but I'm not sure, there's no direct quotes for this. But since no one's ever tried to disprove some of these stories, that leads me to believe they're probably true. Allegedly, after that, Flemings felt bad for slapping Judy, so he asked someone on the set to punch him, and Judy instead kissed him on the nose. Judy would also take uppers and downers while she was working with MGM. Judy would say, in a quote from her biography, "They'd give me and Mickey Rooney pills to keep us on our feet long after we were exhausted. Then they'd take us to the studio hospital and knock us out with sleeping pills. Then after 4 hours, we'd wake up. They'd give us pet pills again, so we could work 72 hours in a row. Half of the time we were hanging from the ceiling, but it was a way of life for us." In the biography, Get Happy, The Life of Judy Garland, it was said that her mother was the first person that started giving her pills. And around the studio, apparently Judy was called an ugly duckling, a hunchback, and a fat little pig with pigtails by the studio. And Louis B. Mayer. MGM insisted that Judy wear caps on her teeth and rubberized discs on her nose to help reshape her nose. And she was also put on a strict diet of chicken soup, coffee, and cigarettes. Later in her life, Judy would detail some of the sexual assault she experienced from Louis B. Mayer. In her biography, Get Happy, they include some lost quotes of tape recordings that Judy did before she passed away that they used to reconstruct the biography. So this is a section from the biography. They would say, "Having sex with female help was regarded as a perk of power, and few women escaped the demands of Mayer and his underlings. Even the mother of Shirley Temple was pawed and propositioned by Mayer, who, according to Judy, was one of the worst of the sexual predators. Between the ages of 16 and 20, Judy herself was to be approached for sex, and approached again and again. Don't think they all didn't try," she said. Top of the list was Mayer himself. Whenever he complimented her on her voice, she sang from the heart, he said. Mayer would invariably place his hand on her left breast to show her just where her heart was. I often thought I was lucky, Judy observed, that I didn't sing with another part of my anatomy. This is so sad. They continue, the scenario, a compliment followed by a grope, was repeated many times until, grown up at last, Judy put a stop to it. "Mr. Mayer, don't you ever do that again," she finally had the courage to say. "I will just not stand for it. If you want to show me where I sing from, just point." To her surprise, Mayer reacted not with anger, but with tears, sitting down, putting his head in his hands and crying. "How could you say that to me? To me who loves you?" he asked, looking so miserable that Judy found herself consoling him. It's amazing how these big men, who had been around so many sophisticated women all of their lives, could act like idiots, she was later to write. And here's some great irony. Harvey Weinstein would purchase the film rights for Get Happy, The Life of Judy Garland, for a film with Anne Hathaway attached, with plans to film in 2014. Of course, this never happened and probably never will, following the end of the Weinstein Company. But I don't know how he could want to make that movie knowing what he's done to actresses in the movie industry. Although these quotes from Louis B. Mayer are kind of just speculation because we don't have any definitive proof that they said these things, Louis B. Mayer would be quoted by saying, "The ideal star being born is bushwash. A star is made, created, carefully, and cold-bloodedly built up from nothing, from no one. All I ever looked for was a face. If someone looked good to me, I'd have him tested. If a person looked good on film, if he photographed well, we could do the rest. We hired geniuses at makeup, hairdressing, surgeons to slice away a bulge here and there, rubbers to rub away blubbers, clothes designers, lighting experts, coaches for everything, fencing, dancing, walking, talking, sitting, and spitting. So just from everything that I've read about MGM, I have no problem believing what Judy said was true, because you can see how invested they were in crafting the perfect look and persona for their stars. And the actors were basically sold to the studio and had to do anything that the studio wanted. And knowing what Judy Garland was going through makes me see The Wizard of Oz through a whole different light. Going back to the filming of The Wizard of Oz, Victor Fleming would also influence changes to the set, like making the yellow brick road look different, along with the cornfields. One of the most impressive parts of the production of The Wizard of Oz was the huge sets. Every scene in the movie was filmed on a soundstage, even the scenes where Dorothy is in Kansas and it just looks like she's in a farm. That was all recreated, and the sets were very big and had large murals in the background to extend them farther. Think about the Munchkinland set had over 100 actors on film at that point. Is almost unbelievable thinking about how small sets are today and how they just make pieces and how they just put green screen around everything else that the actors don't interact with. My favorite set was the poppy field, where they made thousands of handmade fake poppies when they're looking over and seeing Emerald City. Okay, I found out another sad thing while I was editing this video, but I guess the snow that they used in the poppy field scene was 100% pure asbestos. Nothing about this film can be good. The Emerald City set was the biggest in the film. It's almost sad thinking about some of the sets that they spent hours and hours of labor making, and they're only in the film for like one shot. Simplified versions of some of these sets are recreated for Wicked's stage musical, like the Emerald City and the cornfields. On December 28th, 1939, while they were filming a scene with Margaret Hamilton's Wicked Witch, where she exits Munchkinland in a cloud of smoke and fire, while she was going through the trapdoor in the stage, her green makeup, which had copper-based paint, would catch on fire, causing her to have first-degree burns on her face and second-degree burns on her hands. She spent 3 months recovering and recuperating, and refused to do any more special effects shots for the film. On December 31st, the United Press would make an article talking about some of the challenges filming The Wizard of Oz, mainly focusing on the budget. For the last 14 weeks, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer has been shooting behind locked doors on one of its biggest sound stages, The Wizard of Oz, a super Technicolor production of the childhood fable at a cost which is rapidly approaching $3 million. The cast has been one of the most expensive ever assembled for a picture. The properties, the finest. The photographer, the most deluxe. It cost a couple $100 just to turn on the lights. Minimum daily charge for the production is $20,000. Also think about how much money they wasted when they were filming the scenes that they couldn't use. When the film started, Judy Garland was playing the part of Dorothy. Bert Lahr was the Cowardly Lion. Ray Bolger was the Straw Man, and Buddy Ebsen was the Tin Woodsman. For 3 weeks, Ebsen cavorted in a suit of shiny new tin and had a sparkling tin nose, a bright tin strap on his chin, a glistening tin pot on his head, and a coat of brilliant tin paint on his face. Then the director became ill. He was replaced by Victor Fleming. A few days passed and Ebsen got sick. The studio borrowed Haley from 20th Century to take his part. Very interesting here how they're wording this. He got sick. So did the director. So they put me in Ebsen's tin suit and I carried on, Haley said. For 3 days, I was working in a shiny suit of tin. Then, and here's the tragedy of it, someone got reading the original book, The Wizard of Oz, once more. As he read it, his heart sank. The script called for the Tin Woodsman to have been caught in a rain 2 years before, and to be covered with rust. The crew looked aghast at Haley, in his uniform of scintillating tin. The director called the producer, Mervyn Leroy, and said The Wizard of Oz had to be done right or not done at all. So the chemist took Haley's tin pants and covered them with red rust. The cutters junked all of the film in which the woodsman had appeared for 3 days in shiny tin and tried to forget those charges of $20,000 per diem, shine or not. Then Fleming started all over again. The metallic pants are so constructed that Haley must catch his rest on a leaning board. Bolger can bend all right in his suit of synthetic straw, but he must wear a mask of rubber. That's not bad, he said, except when I have to dance. Then my face gets so hot it seems like it's going to explode. Lar, the old-time Broadway comedian, is finding life as the Cowardly Lion no more comfortable. He carries around 60 pounds of fur. It is attached to a real lion skin. Wags have it that the studio killed Leo, the trademark, to make Lar's costume, but MGM says this is a canard. That's kind of funny that they're accusing the studio of using Leo the lion as the suit. They would say in other articles because the lion suit was so heavy, Bert Lahr removed it every 20 minutes to rest. In this other article, they talk about a scene where the witch tries to catch them on fire, and Bolger, who was playing the Scarecrow, wore asbestos underwear to protect himself during the filming because asbestos does have resistance to heat and fire, but there's no way that this was safe. It's crazy how obsessed they were with asbestos back then. So you can hear from all these stories how much they didn't really care about the actors' comfort or safety. The Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Lion actors have said numerous times that filming was very difficult and not fun because of how cumbersome their costumes were to wear and how much maintenance they took. And along with this, there were some other on-set accidents. Margaret, Hamilton's stunt double, Betty Danko, was injured multiple times while doing stunts for the movie, for The Wicked Witch. A crew member would fall on her when she was coming out of a trapped door on set, injuring her shoulder. Later on in February, while they were rehearsing for the scene where the witch writes in the sky with her broom, "Surrender, Dorothy," for the stunt, they placed a pipe underneath the broom that she was sitting on, and the pipe exploded, injuring Betty, causing her to have severe burns on her inner thighs and damage to her reproductive organs. But after 4 months of directing, Victor Fleming would leave the production of The Wizard of Oz to go work on Gone with the Wind, because Clark Gable threatened to quit if George Cukor, the interim director for The Wizard of Oz, was not replaced with Victor Fleming. So he would leave The Wizard of Oz to save the production of Gone with the Wind. It does seem like, from what I've read, that George Cukor was unfairly discriminated against because he would start being known as a women's director for coaxing great performances out of actresses, and it was an open secret in Hollywood that he was a gay man, and it seems like people in the industry were against him for this, but he would go on to have a successful directing career, directing famous movies like A Star is Born, the 1954 version with Judy Garland, and My Fair Lady. In mid-February, Victor Fleming would leave the production after filming most of the Technicolor scenes in Oz, and the veteran director, King Vidor, would take over to finish the end of the production, primarily the sepia-toned scenes in Kansas and filming Over the Rainbow, along with reshoots, like filming one of the most iconic scenes in the film where Dorothy opens the door of her house to see Oz, and inside her house is sepia-tone, but outside is colored in Technicolor. Originally, they were going to do this by hand tinting every frame prior to the part where they needed color, but they decided it was easier just to paint the set and have a stand-in double for Dorothy that was wearing sepia-tone, along with painting the set sepia-tone, and then that scene was shot in Technicolor, and then Judy Garland would swap out with her stand-in to enter Oz. When I was researching, I was surprised a lot of people asked about why they used Technicolor and black and white in the film, and it was an artistic choice, and it was also originally released with those black and white and color sections. It seems like there's a pretty common misconception that The Wizard of Oz is one of the first Technicolor films. Although it wasn't the first, it's probably one of the first that we remember and we've seen, and the film made great use of the Technicolor with all of the beautiful costuming and sets for the film. One of the last sequences of the film to be shot was Judy Garland's solo Over the Rainbow, set in Kansas. So the songs were composed by Harold Arlen, and the lyrics were written by Yip Harburg. So the last one they recorded, Over the Rainbow, is the first song to appear in the film, where Dorothy sings about wanting to be somewhere colorful and beautiful rather than her dreary life in Kansas. The musical actually has a lot more musical numbers than I remembered when I watched The Wizard of Oz recently. All of the main cast get their songs. The Scarecrow sings If I Only Had a Brain, which would be reshot a couple times. They would have a different version with the longer dance sequence, but they would end up cutting it for the final film. If I Only Had a Heart, sung by the Tin Man. Apparently, because they did the original recordings with Buddy Ebsen before he left after he got sick, he can still be heard in a lot of the group songs, like the We're Off to See the Wizard reprises. And then the Lion sings If I Only Had the Nerve and If I Were King of the Forest. And the Good Witch sings a song along with the Munchkins, and the Munchkins get a couple of mini songs while they're celebrating the death of the Wicked Witch of the East, and like the Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead song. The Wizard and the Wicked Witch don't sing at all, but that's okay because they get to sing in Wicked. So filming for the movie would wrap in March, and they would get to editing. Judy Garland would immediately go into filming another project, Babes in Arms, with Mickey Rooney. During editing, some of the studio heads at MGM felt like they should remove Over the Rainbow because it slowed the film down, and they were like, why is our lead singing in a barn? Which is like so upsetting to me thinking about how much Judy Garland had to go through, and then they were like, whatever, we'll just cut her song. And it's also funny because they're so out of touch, they don't realize that that song is going to be the most successful one of the entire film. And they would end up cutting a different song from the film, The Jitterbug, which was sung by the Core Four while they're walking through the woods and they're scared of the witch coming after them. Apparently there was a big bug that gave them the jitters, which they sung The Jitterbug. They would also cut an Over the Rainbow reprise sung by Dorothy when she's locked in the witch's castle. The Over the Rainbow reprise is considered lost media, and all that's left of it is this one picture. Although the original Jitterbug sequence is considered lost media as well, the composer Harold Arlen recorded behind-the-scenes footage on his personal camera, and that has been rediscovered. And studio recordings of the song have been released. With Harold Arlen's video and the audio, you can kind of piece together what the scene would be like. And Over the Rainbow, despite the lukewarm response from MGM executives, would end up winning an Academy Award for Best Original Song for Over the Rainbow, and would continue to be a very important song in Judy Garland's career, and a beloved song for decades. I can't believe that they were like, let's cut Over the Rainbow when, like, If I Only Had a Brain, If I Only Had a Heart, and If I Only Had a Nerve were right there. No one even cares about that song, and they sung it 3 different times in the movie. They would start doing test screenings for The Wizard of Oz in June 1939, and the film was about 2 hours long at that point, so they needed to cut it down to about 100 minutes. So they would ultimately decide to cut the Jitterbug number, the dance sequence from If I Only Had a Brain, the reprise of Over the Rainbow, and a reprise of Ding Dong the Witch is Dead. The film would premiere in August, and Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney would go on an extensive press tour to promote both Babes in Arms and Wizard of Oz, which they just finished filming. The Wizard of Oz became a well-liked and well-received movie. Although The Wizard of Oz was a successful movie, it wasn't exactly a smash hit because of how expensive the budget was. It cost about $3 million to produce the film, and they would get about $2 million back in grosses. It was the 5th highest grossing film of 1939, but their other project, Gone with the Wind, would end up being much more commercially and critically acclaimed. At the 12th Academy Awards, although The Wizard of Oz would get quite a lot of nominations, Gone with the Wind would end up sweeping. Wizard of Oz would win.
To Herbert Stothart for the Best Musical Scoring, The Wizard of Oz. To Harold Arlen and E.Y. Harburg for the year's Best Song, Over the Rainbow from The Wizard of Oz.
And although Judy Garland wasn't nominated for an award, they would give her an Academy Juvenile Award presented for her roles in The Wizard of Oz and Babes in Arms. This was an award that they would have between 1934 and 1960, celebrating actors under the age of 18 for their outstanding performances. Only 12 actors have been presented with the award, the first being 6-year-old Shirley Temple in 1934. But The Wizard of Oz would have the most longevity in the film industry after, in 1956, they would sell the rights for CBS to televise The Wizard of Oz, and then they would again release it for home media in 1980. It would get great numbers premiering on television and be re-released dozens of times for home media, and this would cement the legacy of The Wizard of Oz being seen by new generations of children. And as time went on, the allure of The Wizard of Oz would only continue. MGM has been able to make so much money over the years through merchandising with The Wizard of Oz. Even though at the time in Hollywood, in like 1938, there was this prediction that because of Snow White, there would be this big movement of live-action fantasy films, this kind of didn't end up happening, and I think that's why The Wizard of Oz became so iconic, because it's kind of the first film to attempt this genre. And I feel like the film is also very accessible to audiences across the world because of the fantasy elements of it. I've been looking at other highest grossing movies between the 1930s and 40s, and The Wizard of Oz is basically the only one I've seen. And I think this is probably true for a lot of people. But The Wizard of Oz being mainly set in a fantasy setting, it's so detached from reality that it can be accessible for people from other cultures, which I think is why it was so successful to be dubbed around the world. When I was editing this video, I watched Judy Garland's other film from 1939, Babes in Arms, and I was surprised at the overt racism and sexism in the film. Like Babes in Arms does have a blackface scene. I'm sure most of us have a common understanding that blackface and yellowface were common in the early years of Hollywood, but I was surprised to learn just how prevalent and acceptable it was, not just for comedic roles, but serious ones as well. Any famous actor from the time, Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney, Shirley Temple, had all done blackface, and if Wizard of Oz had any portrayal of other cultures, either from white actors or people of color, I'm sure it would have been pushed under the rug and not seen as a beloved classic, because any sort of portrayal like this would not make The Wizard of Oz an accessible film for people around the world. It would have just been another film that's successful in Hollywood and then would die shortly after. But because it was set in a fantasy setting so removed from our reality, it lets the viewer escape and not focus on the real horrors and tragedies of our world. I think there is an argument for some of the discrimination that was brought on by the popularity of this story for little people being referred to as munchkins, which wouldn't have happened without this film's influence. But I'm also thankful that Dorothy is presented as like a young girl in the film and not a romantic interest for any of the three male leads. There is some implication that she does have kind of a crush on the Scarecrow and his human counterpart, Hunk. Apparently there was a cut ending where they ended up together, but it just seemed unnecessary. But I do think part of the allure of the 1939 film is the practical effects and the makeup and costuming, because it's something we don't really see in movies nowadays. They really built the whole world of Oz on a soundstage, and everything that they did in the movie was basically done through practical effects. There was some editing they did, but it was like, actual cutting room floor editing. They didn't have the crutch of CGI to use for anything that they couldn't figure out how to practically do on set. They had to do everything for the film. And this style of production, I think, will always be interesting to people. I think it's part of the reason that live theater is also successful. I know there's a lot of talk in Hollywood right now about using CGI versus doing practical stunts, or even like using CGI for makeup and things like that. It's just a completely different landscape of filmmaking nowadays. Although I love to see practical effects, I think this does give a bit of an argument against it because the stunts they were doing for this film were so dangerous. Even though Gone with the Wind is a very successful film in its own right, I do feel like Wizard of Oz has a much bigger legacy than basically any other MGM film. But I am so curious what was happening behind the scenes on Gone with the Wind. Maybe that's a deep dive for another day. But I hope you like this journey through old Hollywood. When I started researching for The Wizard of Oz and Wicked, I didn't really know I was going to go in this direction, but I was just so fascinated with everything that happened behind the scenes of this film. And it also makes me question like how we should engage with the film nowadays, knowing all of the horrors that happen behind the scenes. I guess it's kind of like separating art from the artist, but like more like separating art from the production company. I want to say thank you to a website I found while researching Judy Garland Room, who's basically cataloged everything that Judy Garland's ever done in her career, and it was very, very helpful to make this video. I had a lot of other sources as well that I'm going to link below in my Notion page. So many people have done in-depth research into The Wizard of Oz, so it was definitely a lot easier than some of my other videos to find sources for. I also looked at some biographies about Judy Garland's life and the production of Oz, like Get Happy and the official 75th anniversary companion, and Life, The Wizard of Oz, 75 Years Along the Yellow Brick Road issue. I had to upgrade my Everand subscription to get access to these, their premium tier. I was hoping that I could get a referral code, but it says their referral program is down. But I just wanted free credits. Also, speaking of books, I saw the creator of the Judy Garland Room is releasing a book about her life next year. So check that out if you want to learn more about Judy Garland's life. And if you know any other interesting behind-the-scenes details and tidbits about the Wizard of Oz movie production, please comment down below. I know I couldn't fit everything into this video. Thanks, bye!